Welcome back to Saturday Agenda. Jennifer Hewitt from the Weekend Australian is still with us, and joining me here in Canberra, Josh Gordon from the Sunday Age and Andrew Probyn from the West Australian. Thanks for joining us. I want to look back at what was a fascinating, if somewhat expected, result in Parliament this week over the emissions trading debate. We all knew which way it was going to go, and it did, but still, it was interesting to watch nonetheless. Now, Malcolm Turnbull on Monday began the week by unveiling an alternative plan, albeit not one the coalition has yet embraced, but he stood there with his shadow minister and also the independent Senator Nick Xenophon to release the Frontier Economic Modelling, which has put forward a hybrid emissions trading plan. Take a look.
That is greener, cheaper and smarter. That should be the aim. Is greener and cheaper and smarter.
But this scheme can be twice as green at 40% less cost. Then why wouldn't the government want to sit down and talk to us about this?
Josh Gordon, I wonder what the message was there. Greener, cheaper, smarter, but not coalition policy, it emerged.
It's a little bit confusing, isn't it? I think it was a sort of effective thing for Turnbull in a sense, because it suddenly got everyone talking about emissions trading and that sort of thing.
And put some holes in the governance.
It did in a way, I think, so it was quite good. It's quite a complicated sort of proposal, and it has been kicking around for quite a while. It's called a baseline and credit system.
Well, part of it is.
Part of it is, yeah, that's right. I think in a way it's a little bit disingenuous of Turnbull to sort of put this out there, given that there's so much division within his own party on the issue. But having said this, I think it was good politics from his point of view, because suddenly everyone was talking about alternative proposals. People were no longer focusing on Goulburn and Gretsch and Utegate and that sort of thing, so I think he did well.
In hindsight, Andrew Probyn, would it have been better to get this agreed on by the party rem and make it policy before that, or was that simply impossible given the rabble in the coalition?
Well, I think it was impossible. I think what we saw over the winter break, him making these incremental moves towards dragging at least the majority of his party towards him. Now, I don't think he could have presented this to the party and got the same sort of result. So he wanted the headline, he wanted the grab. This is a very complicated system. The government's is very complicated.
They're all very complicated, aren't they?
no one understands these bloody things. But what he wanted was to get the message out there and then present it to the party. Now, it served two purposes. First of all, he got Goulburn and Gretsch out of the headlines, but it also meant that when he came to the party on the Tuesday, he had something else to talk about. And of course, this was going to be a poisonous atmosphere, we were told. We knew that Wilson Tuckey was going to call him arrogant and inexperienced. He wanted to soak up some of that oxygen with something that was positive and had a message. But, it had a simple message, but beneath it was is shocking complexity.
When the vote finally took place, as expected, all the non-Labor senators voted against it, and there were some interesting scenes after a heated debate. Bill Heffernan, the Liberal senator, well known for this sort of behaviour, was giving the finger across the chamber, as you can see there. But after the vote, it was pretty clear from the government, from both Penny Wong and her Assistant Minister, Greg Combet, that this wasn't the end of the story, that they will bring this legislation back before the end of the year. Take a look.
And we will bring this bill back before the end of the year, because if we don't, this nation goes to Copenhagen with no means to deliver our targets. And if we don't, the message to Copenhagen would be that Australia is once again going backwards on climate change.
It should not be underestimated the determination of this government to make this reform, and make it we will.
Now, the implied threat there, of course, is that the government is prepared to go to an early double dissolution on this election and really teach the coalition a lesson. But then Friday morning, Kevin Rudd was asked about the prospect of an early election and did have a different take on things.
I have not the slightest intention of going to an early poll. I don't think people like that. I think they want you to serve the term that you've been elected for. So I would just really like this thing to get through.
Jennifer Hewitt, what are we to make of this? Does the government want an early election or not?
Well, look, that possibility is probably going to be there, but I actually think oppositions in general always get very nervous about the prospect of early elections, and governments in general don't call them for very good reason. It's true, the public doesn't like them. And I think the government has been very useful for the government to have this as a trigger, but also to have the prospect of it frightening the opposition and making them, ever more mulishly confused and not knowing what to do. But do I think there's going to be an early election? No.
Well, Josh, what do you make of that? I mean, Kevin Rudd was pretty strong in his language, saying we don't have any slightest intention of going to an early poll. But he doesn't want to shut down that threat, does he?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I agree with Jennifer. I think he's sort of saying, look, he's still leaving the possibility lingering there by saying, look, we want this legislation passed. Reading between the lines, it says, well, if it's not passed, then there's still a sort of possibility that we might consider it because we've got to get our legislative agenda through the Senate. So I don't think it's entirely vanished. But, I really do agree with Jennifer that, governments don't like early elections. Oppositions are very nervous about them. The public don't like them, and it's probably not that probable.
The point needs to be made, though, Andrew, that most first-term governments do go early, and they do get back in. In fact, all of them have for the last 50 years or so. But a double dissolution's a bit different, isn't it? 70 years, thank you. Double dissolutions are a bit different, though, aren't they? Because you then throw the two houses out of whack.
Out of whack, it becomes complicated. Look, in terms of the calendar, 2007 to 2010 sounds about right. Now, whether you go March or October might not, sound like much, but it does throughout the houses. I think you have a shifting of the Senate, but things are backdated. Then you've got problems later on in the in period 2013, 2015. So, look, I think that's. I think it's almost a promise what he said on Friday. But I also think you've got to remember the context here. The context here is the ETS debate. Now, it's important to remember that ETS that they put up on Thursday had no friends outside of the ALP. And the opposition is making sounds through its current leader, that it will negotiate. Now, in those circumstances, do you think that it'll wash with the Australian public that this is a topic upon which they should go to an election on?
But the problem for Malcolm Turnbull, as you referred to earlier, is the disparity in his party room. Wilson Tuckey has been a pain in the backside for him, so the Nationals on this. Wilson Tuckey has been calling Malcolm Turnbull inexperienced and arrogant, and heading into the party room meeting this week, he was keeping up that rhetoric. Take a look.
Inexperience and arrogance.
Will you tell him that today?
Yes.
But inside the party room, he was slapped down comprehensively, wasn't he, by
Bob
Baldwin, a marginal seat holder, who made it clear that us guys in the marginal seats don't want you out there.
I think that what Turnbull and maybe some of your senior ministers are thinking now is that there's going to be collateral damage here. You're going to have that what some people are calling a velvet divorce with them and the Nats. So the Libs and the Nats are going to split on the ETS, and then you're going to have the collateral damage also within the Liberals. Some people will cross the floor.
That's the more damaging thing for Turnbull, isn't it?
Is it? I don't know. I think that in terms of his leadership, he will want a result here because he thinks that the greatest damage can be done at a double dissolution where they get completely obliterated. They lose stacks and stacks more seats. And maybe it's the juggling of two evils. Then there's the theory within the Libs that they can't win either way, because even if they do force it to a double dissolution election, then the government can simply change the emissions trading scheme to one that they would probably have voted for anyway. And that is founded on the theory that there's people within Labor, some of the senior ministers from Combay through to Ferguson and Crean, who don't like the ETS and want it softened. And they think that the Libs think that we're just letting them off the hook here.
Jennifer, what do you make of Andrew's point that really a split, even within the Liberals, is far preferable for Malcolm Turnbull than an early election?
Well, for the reasons we discussed, I still don't think there will be an early election, but I think there's still a long way to play out with this. And one of the issues I think has been fascinating is that the government has been incredibly successful, and the opposition has been incompetent, partly helped by how they've behaved themselves and all their obvious division on this. But the government has also been incredibly successful in making the opposition the story. The fact is, this is incredibly complex legislation. Not very many people understand it. and when they do understand it, they're going to be deeply worried about the impact. And so everyone, it's one of those things, everyone's for, emissions trading legislation, and this is a great idea until the cost becomes clear, and then people get very, very uncertain about exactly what this will mean. So I think the opposition has a chance. What they'll be trying to do is claim credit for improving it, and the government will be determined to stop them claiming credit and say that it was all their work.
Josh, it was Kevin Rudd who promised to introduce an emissions trading scheme in his first term. That's already been pushed back. Even if this gets through, the start-up date now won't be until 2011. But there is pressure on him to try harder to get this through.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you look at public opinion polls, most people in the public, I think somewhere around 60% of people want this thing passed. And also, I think, if he doesn't sort of manage to get it through, it will sort of be a blight on the first term of his prime ministership. So, I think you're right. He really does have a lot of pressure on him to get this through.
And you look back at John Howard, for example. It didn't hurt him negotiating on the GST and softening some of the aspects of that. I think voters quite like the idea of two parties coming together and trying to find a compromise.
I think that's the crucial point here, that this whole policy's got to be founded on support of the two majors, because it is an economy-altering policy.
You mentioned what about the Greens? They're out of this.
I think they're out of the picture, so are the Nats. I think they've just dealt themselves out of the negotiations here. But because it's an economy-altering, then it has to be, it comes down to a matter of sovereign risk. And that is that you need a system that's going to be supported by both majors, come what may. And that's why the government, probably more so than any time in this this whole debate, has got to sit down and actually afford them some time.
The Nats are out of this. I mean, Barnaby Joyce, after the vote happened on Thursday, was pretty adamant that he's not shifting. Take a look.
We will continue the fight, and we will maintain the rage so that Australian working families get a fair deal, that regional economies are kept up, and we don't have this tragedy of a 20% reduction in regional economies because of a piece of legislation that was never, ever going to do anything.
Barnaby Joyce invoking Gough Whitlam with the maintain the rage. Jennifer, there's nothing in the Nats, nothing in this for the Nats to shift their firm opposition on this, is it? It's what mostly their constituents are saying.
That's right. I don't think the Nats will move really at all on this, and that's fine for them. In some ways, that's good really for them, because it allows them to differentiate themselves and their interests from the Liberal Party. The other point, though, which is interesting, is that Penny Wong and the government has been saying consistently that unless this is passed before Copenhagen, this will be really, really bad for Australia. In fact, there's very little evidence to support that. I mean, because now you've got both parties basically saying they would support a target for emissions reduction, and whether or not Australia has got its legislation through is really in that sense neither here nor there.
And Josh, just a final thing on this whole issue: the decoupling of the bills. A lot of complaints that the government joined at the hip the emissions trading scheme with the renewable energies bill, which the rest of the Senate would support, but not while they're stuck together. Should they have split them apart?
Well, I think they probably should split them apart. I mean, their argument for coupling them together is that they're sort of complementary measures, so, one with the other sort of, and that they need to be together. But I think Kevin Rudd and the Labor will be under a lot of pressure now to decouple them, particularly from the renewable energy sector itself. I mean, they're saying this is disastrous if this legislation doesn't pass. It'll be 20% renewable energy by 2020. So there's a lot of investment hanging in the balance there and things like that. I think it's, clearly politics that's sort of motivating Labor for stapling these two things together, and I think now they will be tempted to actually decouple them.
Now, aside from emissions trading, yesterday we saw the economy come back into focus again. There's good news here. We should point out that the recovery appears to be happening, or around the corner at least. There are positive signs, and the Reserve Bank Governor, fronting a House Economics Committee, a House of Reps Economics Committee, was upbeat about the outlook. But, of course, along with good news comes bad news when it comes to the economy, and that means interest rates are set to rise once again. When? We don't know, but it was pretty clear from Glenn Stevens' comments that we're not talking about a small rise. He referred to interest rates needing to get back to more normal levels. And what does normal mean? Take a look.
Pretty clearly, normal's a good deal north of where the cash rate is now. For the past, going on towards 20 years, probably 17, 18 years, that is, in the low inflation world that we've been in since the early 90s, the average cash rate's in the 5s, I think.
Andrew, the Prime Minister's also been laying the groundwork, preparing home buyers for inevitable rises in interest rates. But it also sounded from Glenn Stevens' comments like we're going to be talking about a gradual, slow increase in interest rates. And that drip is difficult politically.
It is difficult politically, but also maybe it's a sign that the normal transmission is returning and that the economy is improving. So you get this bad with the good. He did make the point, however, that what's normal or what was normal might not be normal for years ahead. And I think what he's referring to there is the fact that you've had the banks over the last few months and the last 18 months have been passing on the full interest rate cut. So their margins are greater because they claim of their lending margins. So I think normal is going to be maybe in the high 4s or low 5s as opposed to always in the 5s as they were in that period of stability that he's talking about.
And Jennifer Hewitt, finally to you, the Reserve Bank Governor was also peppered with questions by the coalition about whether it's time to draw back some of the stimulus spending, the fact that we are now heading back into recovery. Do we need to keep going into debt to the extent the government's getting us into? But he wouldn't buy into that argument at all. He was very defensive of what the government's done as well as the Reserve Bank in stimulating the economy. That was an important rap, I suppose, an important boost for the government.
Oh yes, I think that was a very important boost for the government. If he had said anything different, that would have been very, very difficult for them indeed. So I think it also reflects, however, the uncertainty still about the economic picture and the fact that there will continue to be tough times ahead. And yes, it may not be as bad as people feared, but the reality is that people still don't know. You'd still find plenty of people here who think actually there's going to be, like in a sense, a double dip recession. Things will get a little bit better and then they'll go worse again. There really no one knows. And so I think it's extremely, reasonable for everyone to withhold their firm judgment on this. And, as usual, there's always good and bad, and we won't know until the year becomes clearer. But at this stage, clearly, the signs are what we can be sure about. I think what we can say pretty definitively is that interest rates will go up one way or the other.
I think that's a safe bet. And on that, we'll have to leave it there. Jennifer Hewitt from The Australian, Josh Gordon from The Sunday Age, Andrew Probyn from The West Australian. Thanks all for joining us.
Thanks, Spearsy.
Thank you. That's all for this edition of Saturday Agenda. Helen Daly along with Sunday Agenda tomorrow. We'll see you next week. I'm David Speers. Thanks for your company.